Hello and welcome to 21st Century Vitalism. This is a podcast exploring how we can best maintain a sense of energy, inspiration, and wakefulness while living with the unique stressors of this strange and potent time. My name's Brett, and it's my pleasure to be your host on this journey. Today's episode is all about breathing. Our guest, Robin Rothenberg, is an internationally respected yoga therapist specializing in supporting people with respiratory, immune, and structural imbalances to regain their health through the combined tools of yoga and therapeutic breathing practices. She's also the author of the landmark book, Restoring Prana, a guide to pranayama and healing through the breath. In it, she combines the ancient wisdom of yogic breath practices with the most up-to-date science of respiratory physiology. In this episode, we'll be talking about what makes breathing either functional or dysfunctional. Using Robin's book as a model, we investigate the myths and misconceptions of pranayama and draw a detailed map on how we can return back to the most optimized breathing patterns for health and spiritual insight. Robin was also kind enough to walk us through a guided practice which really emphasizes the conversation much more vividly. So if this is something that lights you up, please consider checking out her book and online offerings over on essentialyogatherapy.com. She actually has a new Restore Your Prana certification course beginning on October 29th for those of you who really want to take the plunge. And lastly, if you want to support this show, the biggest thing you can do is just follow what inspires you from these episodes and consider incorporating them into your life. I really do make this show in hopes that the listeners can find a practice or a view that helps them transform into a more ease-filled version of themselves. So if something really resonates with you, give it a go and then let me know. Send me an email, leave a comment. I'd love to hear if one of these has provided you with a sense of ground and deeper embodiment. Beyond that, you can become a patron over at patreon.com/21stcenturyvitalism. Money does make the world go round and it helps me keep the lights on. So each of you who has already signed up, thank you so much. Genuinely, I make this show out of passion and I would love to continue making this show and have it really support me as I support you. Beyond that, if you don't have the money, that's okay. You can subscribe on YouTube, follow us on Instagram, and like us on Facebook, 21st Century Vitalism. For all of those, more people interacting with the stuff, more likelihood of me getting some really cool guests like today's. Either way, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it and love making this show for you. As for the rest of this episode, without further ado, please sit back, drink some tea, do some stretches, and open your heart for Robin Rothenberg. We are now live. Robin, hello, and welcome to 21st Century Vitalism. I just want to start by saying thank you so much for giving me some of your time. It's really an honor to have you on the show. How are we today?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Brett, for inviting me and being so enthusiastic about this topic.
Yeah. So I was just telling you before we started recording, you were referred to me from a previous guest, Mary Bond, who is someone I look up to in the movement therapy world. And she recommended your book to me, Restoring Prana, which I have right by my hand here. I bought it pretty much right after she mentioned it because it's really in my wheelhouse. About halfway through right now, and wow. It is everything that I was looking for as a massage therapist, wanting to get into the world of breath. And I'm just curious because you have such a deep understanding of both the East and the West's approach to the breath. So I'm curious with you as a yoga therapist, what was it that got you to focus on this specific subject within the world of yoga?
So, thank you for that question. Um, it's really has everything to do with my life journey. I always had problems with my respiratory system. I had chronic health issues as a child, pneumonia when I was 4, chronic ear infections, which it's all part of the respiratory system. Throat infections, tonsillitis, my adenoids were taken out when I was 4. Unfortunately, they did not take my tonsils out at the time. That came later. And in between, lots and lots of antibiotics, and cultivated because of the chronicity of the infections. I developed a chronic cough that my parents would try to subdue with Phenergan, with codeine, which was basically like how I got through my adolescence. They would just, spoon it in and send me off to school because I didn't have a fever and I wasn't really sick, but I had this horrible croupy cough. And that sounded awful, but there was nothing, like nobody thought to do anything about it. I mean, now I realize there were a lot of things that could be done about it. My parents would have done things had they known, but nobody was really talking about it, and nobody even mentioned asthma. But likely I probably should have seen somebody about it and perhaps have been given an inhaler or something. So when I ventured into the world of yoga, which I did kind of accidentally, I really didn't know that it had anything to do with breathing. I was looking for ways to feel better, sort of on the physical. I was looking for a physical strengthening, stretching, kind of feel better in my structural body. And then when the world of pranayama, the yoga teachings about breath came forward and I started playing with them, I immediately had an affinity towards them and I wanted more. And the teachers that I studied with originally had the whole system was rather rigid, which seems kind of oxymoronish for yoga, but there are some very rigid yoga systems, and I was immersed in one of them. And so it wasn't very satisfying, but I was always interested in more pranayama. One of my colleagues said, the thing about you, Robin, is like, you're the only person I know who actually practices pranayama. I'm like, what? I want to do something to help myself breathe better. And so when I discovered Vini Yoga, which is a very breath-centric practice, and started studying in that tradition in yoga therapy with Gary Kraftsaw, who was very knowledgeable about the breath, and started doing deeper breathing practices, I immediately felt like I was swimming in the ocean of where I belonged. And so I went deep into the pranayama practices with that, and through his influence. Unfortunately, some of those practices for me and where I was coming from, and also the confluence of events in my life where I was starting to teach hours and hours for days on end, and I had a new little grandchild that I was talking, singing, cooing to all the time, and I was just constantly putting out a lot of breath, big breath. My coughing, which had really subsided, returned, and a lot of my symptoms from earlier in my life with the chronic fatigue and things like that returned. And I knew it was related to my breath, but I couldn't figure out what to do about it. And none of the pranayama practices that I had learned were helpful. In fact, a lot of them seemed to make it worse. And I got a respiratory infection and I literally didn't stop coughing for 3 months. I couldn't sleep. I was up all night. And I was doing all kinds of pranayamas trying to stop the bronchial spasms. I desperately needed an inhaler, and finally went to my naturopath, and she prescribed one and said, "You have asthma. Like, this really, it's bad." And so it was at that point that I called upon a longtime student of mine who had really eradicated her asthma tremendously through this non-yoga technique called Buteyko breathing. And that took me into the world of respiratory physiology and science, and what is functional breathing and what is dysfunctional breathing. And so then my head was swirling because I started doing these practices from this non-yoga perspective. And you have to understand, I've been studying and teaching yoga and yoga therapy for 30 years at this point. So I was like a believer in, like, yoga had always supported my health and well-being, and then suddenly it didn't, and I felt kind of betrayed. And then I started doing this other kind of breathing that was the opposite of what I had learned in yoga, right? And I'm like, how is this possible? How did the yogis get it wrong, right? And then I went back to the teachings I just took, because I have this kind of sciencey brainiac mind. So it's like, wait a minute, what do the teachings really say about pranayama? And so then I did this deep dive back into the Yoga Sutras and the Hatha Yoga Pradipika and Granta Samhita and a lot of the ancient texts that really look like not I don't want to say not listening to my teachers, but kind of in my mind, I was like going over, like going back in time. And what I found was that there was congruence between the original way in which pranayama was presented and what I was learning and experiencing with Buteyko, which was the less I breathed, the better I felt. Like my cough eradicated within, like in 1 week, 75%. I was coughing less. And my energy came back and my appetite regulated, and I started feeling like I could, be active, physically active again, and I wasn't breathless all the time and yawning all the time and all these things. And when I learned about the physiology, all of it made sense, and it all matched up with not breathing. And then, the teachings also said pranayama is synonymous with kumbhaka. And kumbhaka are the phases of the breath. There's 4 phases of the breath. Inhale and exhale are what we're most familiar with. But in between, there's the space between inhale and exhale and the space between exhale and inhale. Those spaces are really synonymous with pranayama. It's about increasing your capacity to not breathe, to retain after inhale or suspend after exhale without any sense of distress. That is an indication that your physiology is balanced, and it's also conducive to those deeper states of inner quiet and the concentration of mind and the vitality that is required for states like samadhi, not the ultimate unitive consciousness that is the goal of yoga. So that was a long way around, but I don't know how to tell that story short because it really was a journey. It has been a journey, and I do chronicle it in the book. But it was a huge, it was like coming home to find out that yoga really, like the yogis really understood this, and then something got lost in the translation. That's, people say, well, how come if that's the original teachings on pranayama, how did we get into all of this in yoga classes, right? Mm-hmm. I can't say because I wasn't part of that movement, but what I can say is something got lost in the translation because pranayama means to retain prana. Do you want to fill your vessel and be able to hold that prana in so you have vital energy, prana being that life force and sense of vitality. So you don't want to be leaking it all the time. And I got to tell you, is a big leakage of prana. I don't recommend it.
Yeah, it's one of those things that in our culture is so synonymous with relaxation. Like, all right, someone's freaking out. Hey, take a deep breath. And I've been encouraging my clients as a massage therapist to start each session with some deep breaths as well. So what you're saying is that that's actually the opposite of but isn't there something about it that feels good? 'Cause, I feel like in that moment when I'm like, there's something about that it feels like you're kind of just deflating a little bit.
Yes.
So yeah, how does that work?
Yeah. So a couple of things with that. There's every once in a while taking a deep breath to just release tension, that deep sigh, which is can be very healthy and beneficial. Then there's relying on to release tension, which creates actually a habitual pattern that literally throws our chemical balance off. Throws our oxygen and CO2 levels off in relationship to one another. And over the long term, what happens is that we feel an urge and a need to breathe heavier and deeper and take those big, deep sighing breaths or big yawns more and more and more and more. And in doing that, we throw our chemistry off more and more and more. And it's like it wags the tail, gets into a very, very vicious cycle. So there is that idea, okay, of like, taking a deep breath and then you feel more relaxed, or you see somebody do that. It's like, oh, now they're more relaxed than when they were all stressed out. Now I'm going to give you a couple of different other scenarios to consider as well, to just put it in, like, start to maybe even, if nothing else, confuse you a little, so you have to go ponder and go, So let's say you're at a movie theater and a woman comes and sits next to you and she's like, oh, like this. Now, are you going to think, oh, that woman is just so chill and relaxed? Or you're going to be like, oh my God, do you need me to call somebody? Are you okay? Right? Like, what is going to be your response to all of her big, deep breathing?
Yeah, it's going to be concerned.
Going to be concerned. Okay, so that's just hold that in mind. Then, let's say you, and I don't know, I mean, you look like you're pretty fit. I'm pretty fit. However, if either of us went for a brisk walk up a big hill with somebody who was an Olympic athlete, who would get breathless first?
I'm
Us?
going to guess, I'm going to guess me, probably.
Yeah. So breathlessness, right, is equal to or correlated with, associated with lack of aerobic fitness, right? People who are really good athletes can run far and hard vigorously and not feel breathless. So there is something about the capacity to not feel like you need to be huffing and puffing all the time that is actually indicative of health. Yeah. And yet what we're teaching people often to do is to breathe in ways that are correlated with lack of health. So it turns out that people with cardiovascular disease, people who have anxiety, people who have asthma, people who talk for a living, people like teachers, right? Or receptionists or salesmen. These people all breathe harder and faster than normal breath rates. And there actually is like a range, just like we think of, there's a range of health for blood pressure to be, right? Like you want to be somewhere around 120/80, something like that, right? Starts to go way up and you worry, starts to go too far down, you worry, right? There's a range. There's a range for the, healthy levels of carbon dioxide in our system. And I know when people think about breathing, they mostly, if they think about a gas that's involved in breathing, they mostly think about oxygen. But there's some interesting facts about oxygen that don't match people's hyper concern about, am I getting enough oxygen? But really and truly, the internal mechanism in our brain, in our brain stem, the medulla oblongata, that regulates our autonomic nervous system, which is blood pressure and heart rate and breath rate and volume, is keenly sensitized to drops and raises in carbon dioxide levels. And there's many reasons for that. A couple of them have to do with the fact that carbon dioxide is something that we do produce, and we regulate the amount of it internally. So we have control over it. And it has everything to do with how much we breathe. Like we can, by breathing more, we off-gas more CO2, and by breathing less, we off-gas less CO2. By moving more, we produce more CO2, and by moving less, we produce less CO2. CO2 is directly related to our capacity to utilize oxygen. Like we can take oxygen in. I live in Seattle right now. The air quality is good, although I hear the fires and the smoke are on their way. But right now, air quality is good and we're at sea level. So 21% of the air here is made up of oxygen. Most is made up of nitrogen. So when we're taking a breath in, only a good breath at sea level and good air quality place, right? It's only 21% oxygen, and we breathe out 16% oxygen. So we only need, it's not much. I always say I'm not great at math, but I can tell you that's not much, like 5%, right? So I can do that math. So with that, the question isn't needing more oxygen. Clearly, we don't need a ton. The question is, how well are we utilizing the oxygen that we have taken in? And our capacity to utilize the oxygen in our body has everything to do with how much carbon dioxide we have in our body. And if our CO2 levels drop down super low, because let's say we had some kind of traumatic injury, we were in a motor vehicle accident or something, and so that was highly stressful, and then we injured our back, and so we can't go and play pickleball 3-4 times a week like some of us like to do, or do yoga, or like whatever our favorite physical things to do, or could take long walks or whatever. We're not able to be physically active. So that means we're not producing as much CO2, and then we're stressed out because now we've got all these medical bills, and we're running from one doctor to another, and then to the chiropractor and the acupuncturist and the massage therapist, and we're trying to figure out how to resolve this problem. We're worrying, like, we're not sleeping well at night because we're so stressed out, and because it's painful every time we turn over. Like all of these things, we're breathing harder and faster because of the anxiety. So we're off-gassing more CO2, we're moving less, and what happens is our chemistry gets thrown off, and that vicious cycle starts to happen. We're breathing more and we're breathing harder, and then our system shifts, and then it's requiring us to breathe more and harder, and the harder and more we breathe, the more stressed out we feel. And the more our mind tries to make sense of this physiologic sense of not okayness, so it starts telling stories. You know how the mind is really good at telling stories, right? So then the stories embellish and match the state of anxiety, and then that feeds the state of anxiety, and around we go, and we just keep breathing harder and faster, and we get farther and farther away from homeostasis. And it creates what's known as an allostatic load on our system, where our body starts to adapt to our world is skewed, but we start just shifting our gaze so that we're looking at it from over here. And then that starts to feel normal, but it's really not. And the problem is that it's much harder to get back to center, to actually train the body to breathe less and to be okay with more and more tolerance to CO2 levels. Like the coming back to center is actually quite hard to do. It's a challenging practice. It's much easier to breathe more than it is to breathe less. It's like going on an air diet, and nobody really likes to go on any kind of diet, but it feels even more challenging to go on an air diet than a food diet, because there's such a sense of, like, I'm going to die if I don't breathe more, right? Like there's a felt sense of I've been used to breathing this much, and now you're telling me to breathe this much, and it feels like there's not enough oxygen to go around. There's plenty of oxygen.
Interesting.
It's just our body has become accustomed to not having as much carbon dioxide on board, and we've got to reacclimate ourselves to that. I know that this probably sounds complex, and it is. It's way more complex. I'm giving you the physiology, respiratory physiology light, but it's all tied with pH. So it really is a matter of life or death. For those of you that know about pH, we have a very narrow window that is called health and well-being when it comes to our acid-alkaline balance, between 7.35 and 7.45 on a 0 to 14 scale. And if we move just a little bit to the right or left, we start to be out of balance. And if we get to 6 or 8, we're dead. So it's a very small margin. And actually our breathing and our CO2 levels are the most immediate way that our body regulates and manages pH. And that's because CO2 is an acid, but it's a shape changer, chemical shape changer in our body, so it doesn't always stay at the same level of acidity, so it can go more alkaline or more acidic depending on our body's needs. So it is an incredibly potent, powerful, and necessary, vital chemical in our system, and we want to maintain it in its right balance. And when we do that, we feel better. Every system in the body functions better when our CO2 levels are where they're supposed to be. And we feel oxygenated. Our body, we feel like we have energy and our brain is clear, and we get up in the morning and feel perky, and we go to sleep at night and feel tired and sleep well and digest well, and every other system works better.
Mm. Yeah, as I've been reading this book and, I'm immersing myself in this material,
Yeah.
it's made me really, really acutely aware of my own breathing. And I'm recognizing how much I'm sighing, how much I'm yawning. And it is making me uncomfortable knowing the science behind why I'm doing that. But there is something about it that you talk about, like the comfortable pause, like in between the inhale and the exhale. And mine is like 6 seconds.
Between the exhale and the inhale.
Oh,
really
yeah,
different.
yep.
There's a
Yes.
different chemical makeup with the hold after inhale versus the hold after exhale. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for that. But I'm recognizing that mine it's like 6 seconds. Like I am already like
We've got some
gasping
work to
for
do, Brett.
air. I
Yeah.
know. So, and I've also recognized that I mouth breathe a lot, which is another thing we can talk about in a little bit here. But so you've stumbled across this. It wasn't through the pranayama, it's reinforced by that, but it was the buteyko breathing. And this is something that I find to be really fascinating because I found out about it last year when I read James Nestor's book, Breathe.
Right.
But it was something that just kind of came and went in the depth of that book. But then it resurfaced while reading yours. And it's something that I'm immediately fascinated with. So what was your journey like when you started exploring that and taking that more seriously? And I guess really the question is, how do we retrain our breathing when it's so ingrained?
Yeah. I always say there's 2 ingredients necessary to do this breath retraining work. One is patience, because there's no fast way to transform something that is so tied. Literally, if you think about like on a very, very primal level, like life or death, pH, like we're shifting, you're asking your system to acclimate around whether it's going to read that you're alive or dead, right? It's not going to just change because you change the way you breathe for 5 minutes or 20 minutes, right? Like there's a consistency over time. I'm quoting Sutra 112, right, from Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. Abhyasa vairagyam ta nirodha, like consistent practice, uninterrupted over a long period of time. That's the word abhyasa, means all of that. One word. Much more efficient language. Yeah. And then vairagyam is without attachment. Like you just show up and you do it. It doesn't matter if you like it or you don't like it, or you want to or you don't. You just, the commitment is there. You show up, you do it, because you do it. That's how you get to the end point, health and well-being, or the state of samadhi, or your breath changing. So patience required and commitment. And then the other is a sense of humor, like honest to God. Like It's so hard. I would literally, because I'm a writer and I have a good imagination. And so, I felt like everything I just said, like, oh my God, I cannot not breathe like this. Like I'm going to die, And I'd go into this whole story and then I'd be like, well, isn't that interesting, Robin? Apparently you're getting enough oxygen to your brain to make up this whole fiction, right, about how you're going to die if you keep breathing like this. But apparently your brain's still working, so you're still getting oxygen to it and you're alive. So maybe this is just outside your comfort zone, but that doesn't mean it's the end of your life. It just means it's a little uncomfortable, and that's part of the process. So you talk about the big sighs and the yawns. And it's kind of like if you're doing like portion control diet. And then you're like, I had just a little bit of everything. That was good. But now I'm going to have a little bit more mashed potatoes.
It's always the
Like,
potatoes.
right? Right? Who doesn't like a second helping of mashed potatoes? But when you're sighing or yawning, it's like that. And, the relief, it's like a glass of wine or even whatever, a shot of whiskey or whatever, like once in a while, no big deal. Like, fine, it takes the edge off. You had a stressful day or you're out celebrating, no problem there, right? But if you're every time you get a little stressed, you're reaching for whatever it is, the wine or the, joint or what, right? Like you're engaging in those activities in a way that is habituated, like, so you become less tolerant to stress because you're constantly like, oh, it's edgy. I need to do something to smooth it out, make myself feel more comfortable. Breathing can be like that. It can be addictive. Like, the more you breathe, the more you're going to feel like you have to breathe. And the only way to break that pattern is to actually discipline yourself consistently to breathe less. Portion control.
Yeah.
To keep your mouth closed, one. To slow the breath down and bring it down, abdominal diaphragmatic, and we can talk about that, and it's on my list of things to talk about. Get it out of chest breathing. And then to lighten it up, titrate it back. You can start 10% and 15%, right? So it's a little bit less. And you want to find that edge point where it's like you want that second helping of mashed potatoes. Or you want to go to the dessert table at the buffet and you're choosing not to. And there's that craving. You can feel the craving. And then a lot of it is, what do you tell yourself? What's the story you're telling yourself? If I don't have that chocolate chip cookie, I'm going to die. If I don't take a big breath, I'm going to die. And then, like, is it true? You do a little Byron Katie there. Like, is it true? Is it objectively true? Right? Or is this just a story I'm telling myself so that I can hurry up and get myself back to comfort level? And then what's the long-term ramifications and consequences of always staying at your comfort level? For me, it was being in a state of chronic fatigue, brain fog, a sense of constant malaise. It wasn't, I lived that as a kid, and I had experienced life as a healthy person. I was not willing to go back there just because it was damn hard. I can say that, right? Damn hard to change my breath pattern and to learn to be a 24/7 nose breather, take my mouth at night, right? And to breathe lighter and lesser, and to go through the discomfort of suspending my breath for longer and longer periods of time and not giving into the sighs. I had a couple of mantras, Rob. I hear myself go, and I'd literally say, I heard that.
That's a
right.
good
If you
mantra.
can hear yourself breathe, you're breathing too much. That's what I would say. Like, I heard that, right? Like, that was too much because it was audible. Keep it silent, keep it low, keep it slow, and keep it light. And it takes time. I'm a bit of an ambitious person, and I set goals, and then I like to meet them. And I was determined that I was going to get my CO2 levels, get my tolerance back up to normal levels. Like you, I could barely suspend my breath. My comfortable pause was 11 when I started, which I was like, 11, that's not bad considering how bad I felt. And then I found out that was way sucky. So anyway, it took me 5 months of consistent, every day I practiced for between 60 to 90 minutes. And honestly, there were very few periods of time during the day that I wasn't in some OCD way thinking about my breath. Like, I'd be talking to you, but I'd be like, okay, Rob, that was a big breath. Okay. You didn't close your mouth. Take a breath in through I'm inside monitoring. So I was really on it. And until I started in January, I started feeling better right away and noticing the difference, which is what took me into the deep dive and sent me to Dublin to work with Patrick for the first time. And then I studied with him multiple times after that and hosted him at my studio, and just kept studying more and more. But it took me until May to where my CO2 levels, my chemistry was normal. And that was 5 months of like, I literally never, in that first year, probably year and a half, I didn't miss a single day of practice.
Wow.
It was medicine. Like I got how it was impacting me. So I wasn't playing around with it. It was like, this is making a difference. I'm coughing less. I'm sleeping better. I wake up rested. I have a clearer mind. I said to one of my dearest friends, I said, I think I've gotten smarter since doing this. But I hold that, but it's not like my IQ increased. It's the amount of oxygen going to my brain increased. And so there wasn't the lag time between putting pieces together. Like the book. Like I always say, I couldn't have written the book if I hadn't transformed my breath. But not just in terms of the content. Obviously, I wouldn't have anything to have written about. But also my capacity to hold my focus and my concentration. I started writing the book in December of 2017. No, 18. And it was ready. It was published in 2019. It's a 400-page book.
Yeah.
That it was like, but I used my breathing throughout to keep me focused and keep me attentive and present and on track. It was my primary tool.
So for the people who might not have a relationship to yoga or consistent practice, a big part of what this show is to try and appeal to folks who may not have any contact with consistency like this. So for somebody who is hearing this and like maybe has a subtle knowing like, wow, I'd really benefit from this, but that sounds really intense and I don't know how I could ever commit. Like I am just not a disciplined person. Like, do they just have to want it more? Like, how do you get yourself to that point where you're really willing to take this uncomfortable work on?
Well, motivation is a whole nother topic.
Yeah.
What motivates people. When I switched from being a yoga teacher to a yoga therapist, one of the reasons, there were many reasons why I made that choice, but one of the upsides, one of the rewards of doing that was my clients were motivated to practice because they were suffering.
Yeah.
People who were just like coming to do yoga for fun, it was like their recreational activity, were less motivated. But the people who had back pain were motivated. The people who were having insomnia or chronic headaches, like me, it was medicine, right? So they were motivated to practice. So there is something about that, right? And then individually, I work with people like find the carrot. What's the carrot for them? And then frame it around that. So there's a skill and an art as a therapist to help with that. In general, though, I would say a couple of things. The first thing is to become aware of your breathing. Like you said yourself, like, wow, this is making me aware of my breath. We breathe between 25 and 30,000 times a day.
Wow.
Right? So even as OCD as I described myself, it was a drop in the bucket of the number of times I was actually breathing per day. If I paid attention 50 times a day to my breath, which might seem like a lot, but if you think about how many thousand times I was breathing, you could say, well, but that was hardly any percentage of, I can't do the math, but whatever, of the amount of time she was actually breathing, right? But it makes a difference. So any amount. So I want to say this on the level of encouragement, becoming aware. Notice first off, do you tend to be a mouth breather? And people can be like a slack-jawed mouth breather, but you can also be more of a subtle mouth breather, right?
Yeah.
Mouth breathing is definitely one of the primary dysfunctional breathing patterns that are super common, and people will often say, I'm not a mouth breather. No, I don't think I'm a mouth breather. And I'm watching them mouth breathe, but they don't think it's like that. But, it's on a continuum. So lips sealed. That was another one of my mantras. Lips sealed, Robin. Lips sealed. Notice how many, your tendency to sigh or take big yawns. At the end of the day and you have a yawn or two, no big deal. But if you're like, walking around all day yawning, that's an indication of a dysfunctional breathing pattern. So just start to be like, oh, I want to become curious. I think
Mm-hmm.
curiosity is the best ingredient in life. Like, right? If you
Mm-hmm.
at least can be like, huh, that woman on that show said something about, and I noticed, like, I am yawning a lot, or I do sigh, like, maybe more than I need to be sighing. Like, what is that about? Or I hear myself
Mm-hmm.
breathing all the time, or I feel myself chest breathe, right? So become aware and become interested in it. For sure, people don't practice what they're not interested in.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I just did the inverse, but there is a yoga sutra about that too. Like meditation, like it doesn't matter what you meditate on, fine, but what matters is that you have an affinity. Like you're not going to focus on something you don't have an interest in. So if
Mm-hmm.
you don't have an interest in changing your breath, for sure, you're not going to practice.
Yeah.
So there has to
Yep.
be some hook, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Either like I think my breathing's fine, but I don't know, this woman said something, so I'm going to just like pay attention to it. Like at least there's something, there's some curiosity there. So that's the first thing. And then becoming aware, just noticing and see what it's like to hold yourself to for 10, 15 minutes at a time, only breathing through your nose. And then shift it to 20 minutes and then 30 minutes, like, right? And then noticing how it feels. If you are a regular mouth breather and a big breather and you seal your lips, except when you're talking and eating, and Krishnamacharya, who's a very famous yogi and yoga teacher guru from the yoga tradition, always said, eat less and talk less.
Mm-hmm.
um, just in terms of, like moderation, right? Just like only what's necessary. Like eat what's necessary to keep yourself vital and healthy, but excess in that direction is not healthy. And also say what you need to say, but don't say more than you need to say.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Make conscious choices. Those are the two activities. Well, there's a few more, but right. And there's an appropriate place and time for all of those. I'm a fan, but like again, moderation. And then the rest of the time, why should your mouth be open? There's no reason. None.
Yeah.
This is what we were born to breathe with. This is our breather. Like our eyes are our seers and our ears are our hearers. Like get your senses in order. The nose is extremely competent at breathing. There's all kinds of apparatuses, not just in our nose, but in our whole nasal cavity, which is a world inside that is full of all kinds of things that help to prepare the air for the lungs so that what we are breathing in is clean and moist and warm and in the best possible condition for us to take it in. And when we breathe through our mouth, we're breathing in cold, dry, dirty air, like
Mm.
really dirty air. We missed our, filter system, and that's got all kinds of antimicrobial and antibacterial and antiviral components. When everybody's masking, I'm like, here's the first mask, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, put that mask on, and already you have less opportunity to be taking in viral load into your system. So, nose breathing, breathe lighter, breathe less, and then we can get into the practice of core breathing and activating more diaphragm and less accessory muscles to also calm the nervous system down, because it's not just a physiologic thing. The thing with the breath is it's biomechanical, biochemical, and then it's psychological, because our thoughts
Mm-hmm.
drive our breathing too. Because if I start thinking about, oh my God, and what if this happens, and then my breath is going to get all excited, right? And then
Yeah. Yeah.
my heart rate's going to go up, and then that's going to cause me to breathe harder and faster. And so we have to work it multidimensionally. It's not
Yeah.
just one way in.
Yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to offer my Buddhist meditation teacher. His name is David Nichtern. One of the things he says is to be mindful of your pie hole, and I just think that that is very fitting for this
Love it.
conversation. But the idea of
Yes.
only utilizing your mouth when you're actually eating or breathing, it really does, or not breathing. That's the opposite. Eating or talking, it really
Mm-hmm.
also accentuates the idea of really building up a sense of self-awareness as well.
Yes.
That's another dimension that I think is really important for spiritual practitioners, is that by taking on this work of retraining your breath, it really gives you a lot of kind of guideposts for where your mind is at any point. So it's a really wonderful mirror if you take this as a goal, even if the goal is to just increase your self-awareness, which is
Yes.
a really important benefit as well.
Absolutely. You said that very well, and it's very true. I know many people, including myself, that struggled with meditation, like just sit and be quiet. I'd either like doze off or like get bored or right, like, and
Mhm.
then doing this breathing practice and having to focus so acutely to how much I was breathing. Was it too little, too much, slow, fast? Like really monitoring every breath, which is very much a meditation on the breath.
Mhm.
And I had a great affinity for it, so it worked, right? I liked it. But I would go into these deep states of meditation. I've had students who have said, I never felt like I could meditate, but that breathing practice, I feel like I just meditated. I mean,
Mm.
that's what I have imagined meditation is, and I could never get there. And of course, um, in the yoga teachings, pranayama precedes the states of meditation because they help to support the state of meditation by all of the things, all the mechanisms, the quieting and the focus and the stilling. As the breath becomes more still, the mind becomes more still. Now, if you've ever been in a state of deep meditation, one of the things that you may have noticed is that as your mind got very still and quiet and there was more and more space between the thoughts, there might even have been a point where you think, I don't even know if I'm breathing. Like the breath becomes so fine and light because if the mind gets quiet, the breath gets quiet, they wag each other's tail. It's a very fundamental teaching in yoga. So it's which doorway are you entering? For some people, they can enter through the doorway of the mind, quiet the mind, and then the breath automatically will quiet. But for some people, if the breath is doing this, the mind is not going to settle. It's not until the breath you train and support, you know, the respiratory system in calming and settling down that then the mind can settle. So,
Yeah.
of the two, for most people, not everybody, for most people, coming in through the doorway of settling the breath and focusing on the breath because it's a little bit more, it's a bigger stick to hold than the mind. The mind, if you think we breathe a lot, we think more than we breathe.
Mhm.
So if you think with 30,000 times a day, yeah, we probably think 60,000, thoughts, is
Yeah.
not 100,000 thoughts a day.
Yeah.
Our minds are
Yeah.
very active. Some people more so than others.
Mhm. Yeah, just like me recognizing how much I was breathing in dysfunctional ways, that was one of the things when I started practicing mindfulness was and this is kind of a common report of everybody is they're like, I think I'm thinking more. And it's like, no, you're
Yes.
actually just recognizing the thoughts, which is kind of like
How
the first
pervasive thinking
stage.
is happening as you tune into it. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not a
And that,
problem. The mind's job is to be busy.
yeah.
It's just if we get carried away and we follow it, then it gets busier and we can train our mind like we can train our breath to create more and more kumbhaka, more and more space
Hmm.
between the thoughts, between the
Yeah.
breaths.
Yeah, and that reminds me. I have a really phenomenal yoga teacher as well from the Anusara tradition, and the way she teaches, she's been doing it for like 40 years herself, and it's
Mm-hmm.
very subtle. And that's what I've also recognized is that subtlety is advanced, whereas I think
Yes.
the common conception is that the really big poses, the really fast, sporadic motions are the most advanced because they're difficult. But really, the difficulty is maintaining like many points of awareness at once and not losing the script. And that's what I really like
Very
about the
much.
biomechanical considerations. We're talking about keeping your mouth closed, breathing through your nose, and then also all the subtlety in diaphragmatic breathing. Like having all of those operating in tandem and then still remaining present to me, like that's the advanced, that's how you actually maintain that sense of expanding presence.
For sure. For sure. Should we go into a little practice, do you think?
I'd love that. Yeah.
Okay. Um, so we talked about, both of us have mentioned this abdominal diaphragmatic breathing. So I'm just going to move my camera down a little bit so that you can see more of me.
Hmm.
Um, So, first of all, I want to clarify, like the diaphragm, which sits underneath the rib cage and attaches to the lower ribs, and it's, all the way in the back as well in the front. There's more diaphragm tissue. It's a muscle, right, on the sides and in the back than in the front. And there's more blood flow in the lower lobes of the lungs than in the upper lobes of the lungs. So movement of the diaphragm increases, good movement of the diaphragm increases perfusion, the exchange of the gases, oxygen and CO2 from the lung tissue into the bloodstream, where it can be then delivered or deposited, right? Either from the body to the lungs in the venous system or in the arterial system, from the lungs out to our pinky fingers and toes and up to our brain. Okay, so we want to have more movement of the diaphragm, not less, because it is our primary breathing muscle. And there is no breath that is not diaphragmatic. Like, you cannot breathe without your diaphragm. If your diaphragm was paralyzed, you would stop breathing. I'm not going to go into it, but there's a fascinating experiment that was done a long time ago. It wouldn't be able to. It wouldn't be legal to be done now, but it's really super fascinating. People volunteered to have their diaphragm paralyzed.
Oh my God.
And they didn't ever get a call to breathe. So every breath has diaphragmatic movement. The question is how much, how full. Like, it's a muscle, like any other muscle in your body. You want it to be strong and have some, flexibility to it. So the diaphragm can be weak. It can be hypertonic. It can be sort of like just chronically stressed, like people have a lot of hypertonicity in their neck and shoulders. Largely, I want to say, because they just breathe. There is no chronic tension in the neck and shoulders, in jaw, TMJ. If the breath is not being addressed and the breathing pattern is not being addressed, I don't care how much massage, which I love, right? And how much yoga and how much whatever you do to work the muscles, if you don't change your breathing pattern, I guarantee you that's driving that bus, because those muscles are hypertonic. They're just chronically tense and tight. So abdominal diaphragmatic breathing is about utilizing your abdominal muscles to support good full range of movement of the rib cage, which supports and assists good diaphragmatic movement, right? So it's a way of conditioning the diaphragm and supporting that idea of low, slow breathing, getting out of the chest breathing pattern. And I'm a kind of an efficiency person. I like I'm busy. People are busy, right? Mm-hmm. So if you can do more than one thing simultaneously, all the better. I'm big on core, and it turns out that the transversus abdominis, which is one of the primary core muscles that helps to stabilize and support the lower back and the sacrum, also supports that movement. It also attaches on the top edge to the rib cage, and it moves in the same direction as the diaphragm. When the transverse abdominis contracts and pulls the ribs in, it supports the diaphragm moving into its resting position. And then when the transversus abdominis relaxes and the ribs move out, it supports the diaphragm in moving fully into its full range and spreading the ribs out, moving down and out. So when we incorporate those movements, link them together, it helps to increase the diaphragm's range. It increases more of a parasympathetic response. It strengthens your core, and it gets you out of chest breathing, paradoxical breathing, reverse breathing, which is another dysfunctional breathing pattern. And all of that is supported by nose breathing. Nasal breathing and more activation of the diaphragm go together. Chest breathing and mouth breathing go together. It's part of our wiring, because when we're chest breathing, we might be having to call for help or run like the bejesus away from the lion. So they go together. It's stress breathing. right? As opposed to everything's chill, we're okay breathing, which is nasal, low, and slow. All right, so that's a little, sort of precursor for why we're going to do what we're going to do. So I'm going to have you all, and Brett, you're going to be my little guinea pig here. So hand on your chest, hand on your lower rib cage. And just take a few breaths to just notice where you feel movement in your body. So this is everybody out there in listening land, right? You're all doing this. So this isn't a spectator sport. Get on in there, get in the breath pool with us, and observe your own breathing pattern. First of all, notice if automatically you go into nose breathing and you have a nice lip seal, or if there's a little bit of space between your lips, and can you just touch them together? Just soft touch of the lips. And then notice if the breath is moving up and down, the direction of movement. Notice if it's moving out and in, forward, back. How would you describe it? Get to know your breath. Invite it over for tea and say hello. And notice if you feel movement happening under your upper hand or under your lower hand or some combination. Noticing if you feel the breath has a steady quality to it, or if you've got like a couple of short breaths and then a big breath, without judgment. Like, I always encourage people to just observe everything without judgment. Just notice. Like if you're not able to get to know what you do, what your pattern is, how do you know how to change it? Right? It's like trying to get somewhere on a GPS system without knowing what your starting point is. Okay, that's where you're going, but where are you coming from? Right? It matters. So getting to know, and you can put your hands in a variety of places, right? Side ribs. Do you feel any movement? Do you feel any out in movement, or does it just not? Does it still feel up down? Do you feel lots of movement in your belly, but not really in your rib cage? Do you feel it in the back? You can put your hands on the back. And also right side and left side can feel different. I mean, the lobes of the lungs aren't the same because the heart sits to the left, so the left lobe is smaller. But then you might have a particular condition that means one side of your body breathes more efficiently than the other. So there's so many, like we could just do an hour just on that, just breath awareness. And I highly recommend it. Like when you're sitting, when you're standing, when you're lying down, you could just you're in the shower. How am I breathing? You're chopping vegetables. How am I breathing? You're sitting in the car, in traffic. Like put one hand, where am I breathing? What's happened to my breathing? Okay. So now let's have you move your hands so that you have one on your lower belly and one on your upper belly. So you still have that awareness with the upper hand of the space between the ribs. And we're going to work with the space between the ribs. If you halfway through the book, you got to the diaphragm, which is that's chapter 6, the middle of the book. It's all there's a lot in there with the diaphragm. I love the diaphragm. Anyway, and this zone of apposition, this area right here, and the movement of the diaphragm. So again, you might notice as you are inhaling, there's an expansion of the belly, and as you're exhaling, there's an internal sort of contraction. And you might feel more under your lower hand or more under your upper hand. And some of you may be like, I'm not feeling that at all. I feel like when I breathe out, my belly goes out. When I breathe in, nothing much happens. Or my belly goes in when I breathe in. That's an indication of paradoxical or reverse breathing, and something that I highly recommend you pay attention to and start to transform. So let's have you imagine that as you're inhaling, you're inflating, like you're inflating a balloon, like really stretch your belly, the whole of the belly as you breathe in. And then as you exhale, I'm going to have you say shh. You don't have to put your finger here, but shh. That's it, Brett. Keep going and going and going and going and going, and see if you feel like you're squeezing the air out of that balloon. Like, can you feel the contraction of the abdominal muscles coming in and of the rib cage. You want one low, one high, so you can feel what's happening. You want the ribs also to kind of tether in. And then close your mouth, and inhale and expand. And then again, Now I know I said, no mouth breathing, don't mouth breathe. And now I'm teaching you to mouth breathe. This is training wheels, where it's not, it's a means to an end, right? So to get the felt sense of that core engagement. Now, once you have that feeling of the abdominals, kind of like you're zipping up a tight pair of jeans that just came out of the dryer, that feeling, right? Once you get that feeling, which is the engagement of the transversus abdominis, what you want to do is go back to nose breathing, but still work with the abdominal muscles out as you inhale and in with that zip in and up as you exhale. And then if you feel like you want to go to the next level, just pause and hold that contraction for 3 to 5 seconds. And see then if you can, in a very relaxed, an ungraspy, unurgent way, inhale. So if you feel yourself going, okay, and going into a gasp, then only maybe a 1 or 2 second pause after exhale till you build your capacity up. So it's the expansion, chest to belly or lower ribs to pelvis on the inhale, and then the zipping in and up on the exhale. And oftentimes I'll have people use the shh as a mechanism to help them to find that transversus abdominis. I have a number of different exercises, several of them in that chapter 6 and 7, on how to work with the core muscles to support the movement of the rib cage in. What I want to say about this, are you still working with it? Right? Yeah. You're working your core breathing. Mm-hmm. Good. Is everybody out there? You can still core breathe and listen to what I'm saying, I think. You can multitask a little bit. Okay. Which is this. Oftentimes people feel when they're breathless, like the problem is they're not getting enough in. And so then what they want to do is power the inhalation. And what they do when they do that is create a lot of tension and go right up into activating the chest, the shoulders, the jaw, the neck, everything up here. And what that does is actually it creates tension in the diaphragm and kind of fixes it. It doesn't actually move as wide and broad, and it therefore is not as efficient in its action. And then what happens on the exhale often is nothing. The belly just kind of stays flaccid and the ribs stay kind of locked in that not all the way open and not all the way closed position. And it would be like holding your arm in, like, okay, it's one thing if you're doing a bicep curl, right? And you're contracting and then you're extending and then you let it go and you go live your life. You don't walk around like this with it partially contracted and tense all the time. But many of us have our diaphragms fixed and locked in that midpoint where it's neither opening all the way or closing all the way, or drawing in all the way, so it never gets a chance to rest. And what that does is it creates a very hypertonic, chronically tight diaphragm that's weak, deconditioned, and that's going to keep trying to breathe you. So it starts to get into the whole thing of like, not enough, got to do more. And then you keep trying to get more in, and again, it's another way the biomechanics, right, keeps that vicious cycle going. So the engagement of the abdominals and this core action that's really supported by the sound and the tethering of the rib cage in, what you're actually doing when you do that is you're putting your diaphragm in a little bit of shavasana. It's like nap time. It gets to relax. You're putting it into its passive resting position. And then when you let go of the abdominals, diaphragm's super smart. it will breathe you. It will automatically, if you focus on the exhale and the bringing everything in, like that zipping all the way up, high waters, then you will be able to breathe with more ease and freedom on the in-breath. It will happen by letting the abdominals go. And you don't have to effort through the neck, through the shoulders. And you will feel like you got that deep breath without making it a big breath. So there's an effortlessness to it. It's more efficient. Remember, it's lower, so you've got more blood exchange down here, better perfusion, low and slow. And then starting to lighten it up, to put your finger under your nose and just titrate. Like, how much air do you feel brushing across your finger? Can you make it just a little bit less? And you're going to scale it back to that place of portion control, not to where it's pushing you over the edge and you start feeling panicky or gaspy, but like, okay, this is less than what I'm used to. This is a little uncomfortable, and always an and I could do this for 3 to 4 to 5 minutes. It's not my favorite thing, but I could do it. And you start to build your chops up to where you do that on a regular basis consistently, and your body will start to acclimate to less breath. It's the only way to get used to breathing less is to practice breathing less.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for that walkthrough. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting considerations in there. I did read the chapter, but just to ask you, does that engagement of the transverse in that under the rib, does that correlate to the bandhas, like below the belly? Is there a relationship with that?
Have you gotten to chapter 7?
Yeah, but I just think it's
chapter 7
interesting.
is all about
Yeah.
the relationship between the core muscles and the bandha muscles and breathing. The diaphragm is very much like the bandhas, which are these locks or seals that involve the pelvic floor muscles, and the transversus abdominis, the Uddiyana bandha. The stomach lock is actually the activation of the abdominal muscles, all of them, but primarily the transversus abdominis. Along with the obliques, a little bit of rectus, but not really, mostly the deeper core muscles. Rectus is the most superficial. It's the one that shows, but is, and not that it's not useful, but it's not the first one I go for when I'm helping people with back pain and things like that. I always go transverse TVA first. So yes, they are very much correlated with and then the neck, the Jalandhara Bandha, which has everything to do with placement of the jaw. Because, if you've got your head forward, got shoulders forward, head forward position, you're going to be definitely likely to be a mouth breather and likely to be a chest breather. They go together, and likely to be a rapid breather. Getting your shoulders back and your head placed and your jaw aligned to be able to do Jalandhara Bandha, it's not just a structural piece, but it's also a breath retraining piece. So the yogis, again, were very wise because all of these bandhas were in relationship to pranayama. Pranayama was practiced with the bandhas because there was this understanding that the biomechanics support healthy, functional breathing. So then that was the other thing that got lost in translation. It was like, oh, bandhas are super hard and you got to have a certain lifestyle and blah, blah, blah. We'll just do breathing without the bandhas. Okay, but so I teach engagement of those muscles and syncing those muscles and the connection of those muscles with the breath without going into like the deep bandha practices. People can go there if they want, but I just want people to feel better, in their lives. And I say there's very few things that I would say 100% are going to be positive for 100% of the people, but learning how to be a functional breather and how to engage your core and have a strong core. I've never heard anybody say, I'm just really pissed off that you taught me how to engage my core. Ever since I became a functional breather, I felt worse. Never has happened, and it won't, because it can only upside to those two things. And they go together intentionally. That's the way we're built. That's how we're supposed to be living.
So, I know we're getting close to time right now, but I think it is important, and you did mention before this that it was a crucial piece of the trainings that you do, and that is the EBA, the energetic bank account. So, we're talking a
Yeah.
lot about creating functional breathing. We're talking about
Mm.
feeling better. So, this is a pretty big topic in your book, and I'm just curious if we could touch up on that a little bit about
Okay.
what that is and how that fits into
Yeah.
this process of breath retraining.
Yeah. So I'll give a little bit of, like teaching from the yoga, from the Upanishads, from the yoga teachings, and then kind of update it and kind of make it a little more accessible to everyday life, because it really is. So there's this idea from yoga and Ayurveda being sister science to yoga, that our health and well-being has everything to do with our capacity um, to function well energetically. Our prana, like prana is a big topic in this world, and it has everything to do with like how well our prana, how well we manage our prana, and how full our pranic reservoir is, really is very indicative to how healthy we are physically, mentally, how perky we feel when we wake up in the morning versus kind of dragging through our days or needing a ton of naps and that kind of thing. So that's a pranic issue, and it's the baseline for yoga and Ayurveda is how to support healthy prana. And it turns out pranayama, you might have noticed those words are related. Prana is in the word pranayama. And the part of our system that governs prana is called the pranamaya, that particular sheath of our body, or part of aspect dimension of our body that governs how we take in and how we put out energy. And it's not just input, output, which is how most of us live in our life. But there's this understanding that after we take in, like you take a bite of food, ideally we chew it and chew it and chew it and chew it, and then we wait. So we digest it before we take in another bite. Now, many of us live our lives by, right, spooning it in, whether it's we're spooning in the next book or the next training or the next whatever, the next, activity, social event, the next movie, right? We're binging on the next episode, like taking in without any time for digestion. And that's a problem. It's a pranic problem. And then what's the number one advertisement for on TV? Really and truly, it's not erectile dysfunction, but we can talk about that too, because that's also a pranic issue. But anyway, but it's really digestive aids, right? Because people, right? Too fast, too slow, too much going out, nothing going out, right? Okay. Yeah. So elimination, like the putting out, how are we putting out our energy? And if we don't digest and allow, after we digest some of what we've taken in, assuming we've taken in healthy food, nourishing food and ideas and thoughts and experiences, we want them to become a part of us, right? We want them to feed and nourish, not just our physical being, but our mind and, right? And our emotions and our spirituality and our whole way of living in the world. So that also takes time. There's time required for digestion. There's time for assimilation. And then what we put out, we're putting out just the right amount. Like some of it we're holding on to because it's nourishing. Like diarrhea is seriously a problem. People end up dehydrated and undernourished because they're taking in stuff, but they can't retain it. They can't assimilate it. So it's not nourishing them. And of course, constipation is huge problem. Not being able to let go of anything, right? So all that crap just gets stuck in there. This is a pranic issue. And as it turns out, according to the yoga teachings, it has everything to do with how we breathe. And the more we are able to put those pauses, like inhale, pause, that's called digestion. Exhale, pause, that's assimilation. And we start to bring more attention to those and not so much of what can I take in, what can I put out, but I just took something in, and now I'm just going to pause and just be with that, whether it's a breath or a bite or a conversation or an article. I'm not going to fill my head with something else. I'm just going to be with that and see what part of it really is mine, like really is going to inform my life, transform my life. And what part of it like doesn't really resonate, isn't like I'm not ready for it, or it's just not useful for me right now. I'm going to let it go. Right? So can you see that it really, this idea of the energetic bank account is really looking at it on a multidimensional level. What are you taking in your life, and what's the rate of what you're taking in? Like people say, well, I eat really healthy, but it's like, okay, but how much are you taking in, and how fast? Are you taking time to chew in between your bites? Like, right? I read really good things. Okay, but how many books do you have going simultaneously?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And how much are you really retaining? And what is the intention there? Because then people are all stressed out because like they haven't finished any of their books. And so all that energy is getting expended that way. It's like, what about less? Right? It comes back again. When people start paying attention to their EBA, I would say pretty much across the board, they're like, oh, I need to do less. I need to pause more, which means doing less, right? I need to give myself more time. I need to slow down. This is what I hear over and over again. And of course, all of that, when the pace of life gets slower, the breath gets slower, the mind gets calmer, the mind gets calmer, the breath gets slower. We feel more okay with doing less. And it takes us in the direction of vitality and health and well-being. I know people always say, like, Robin, you're so perky, blah, blah, blah. You know, really and truly, I'm perky because you don't see the times I do very little. Like I do my practices and I stay very quiet. And I have off times every day. And I monitor that very well. I monitor my prana. And if I know I'm going to be doing a podcast like this and talking for an hour plus, then I'm going to be doing something before and after to shore that up, because I know this is big pranic output right now. I'm talking, and I'm talking enthusiastically. I'm probably not functional breathing to the, like closing my mouth between every single phrase and breathing through my nose, right? So I know that afterwards, if I go and I socialize, I'm going to end up really tired by the end of the day. So I'm going to be really quiet, do some of my own breathing practice to recoup and fill my pranic reservoir like I know how to do, so that then I can have, keep my energy balanced and even through the course of the day.
Yeah.
So that's a little hint of what the EBA is about, but I guarantee you that if you start paying attention to keeping your energetic bank account really full, like you're going to feel better. But it also is going to require that you make fewer withdrawals, that you allow it to accrue interest, right? Like as soon as you put something in, you can't pull it out and think that you're going to have anything to spare. You're going to always be at the edge. And this is people with chronic fatigue and autoimmune issues. This is a huge topic. Huge topic, EBA.
Well, it's interesting because this idea of waiting and digesting has a lot to do with how we relate to spaciousness. I feel like, especially here in America, we have a tendency to constantly be doing. We're really focused on the idea of becoming something. And I notice it in spiritual communities a lot. We treat spiritual practice in kind of a materialistic way sometimes, where we're kind of looking for the next reward. We're looking for the next thing, oftentimes because we're uncomfortable with space, even though just resting in space would actually be the thing that would allow us to be more present, to be a little bit slower with how we move through life and more intentional. And I just think that that's an interesting thing to really emphasize that. But it's hard, again, it's kind of an uncomfortable thing to just sit with where you are and then to accept it, because it might not be where you want to be. So like sometimes digestion can kind of slow you down and make you want to just kind of sit and just like, okay, I have enough. But, we have to really counteract that idea that we never have enough, which is deeply ingrained.
Yes, it's not really the truth, but it feels like the truth. right?
Yeah.
And that's,
Yeah.
again, coming back to this titration of the breath and portion control, and um, breathing lighter and less than what you're most comfortable and used to, accustomed to breathing, is a way of practicing this is enough. There's the
Yeah.
fiction in the mind of it couldn't possibly be enough. It doesn't feel like it's enough. It's not what I'm used to. And then it's like, okay, but is what I'm used to actually healthy, right? Or is it
Mm.
like more than what I actually need? And am I actually retraining my whole internal mechanism to be in balance? Because
Yeah.
that's my experience, is that by reducing the breath, I found that it reduced my cravings for sugar and carbs, like just naturally. Like I dropped 15 pounds in those first 5 months, not because I was trying to lose weight, but because, which is where I am now, but like I just I felt satiated. I started
Mm.
feeling satiated sooner in all aspects of my life. Like, oh, I don't need a big blah, blah, blah. Like I'm okay just being here. I don't need anything more to be happening. My
Yeah.
mind got quieter. Everything felt like there was enoughness without a lot of fanfare as
Yeah.
I quieted the breath. So it's been a profound practice for me, and I've been really blessed with being able to share it with many people who have had the same experience or similar. So happy to
One.
share it with you and your listeners.
Yeah. Yeah, I am very delighted by this conversation. This is pretty much everything that I want to have on the show. So,
Mm,
we are at that time. So I do want to say thank you so much
you
for
bet.
coming on and sharing this work. I just think it's so vitally important, no pun intended, to the name of the show and what you have going on.
Yes,
But
right.
really, thank you so much. I know it is a big expenditure of energy, but I think it's going to really resonate with people. So,
Yeah, and fortunately at this time in my life, I have a good savings account in my chronic reservoir, so I can do this without. There's a little bit of a cough. That's my canary. It's like trying to shut up,
mm.
Robin, right? But but I'm not going into a whole coughing fit. Which a couple of years ago, if I talked like this for an hour straight, I would end up in a whole coughing fit afterwards. So yeah. So
Yeah. So, for the people who are really vibing with this conversation, where can they find you? And are there online ways that they can interact with
oh yeah.
you? And what do they do next?
So yeah, lots. So first, you want to hold up the book?
Yeah, it might be backwards on the screen, but
No, it
that's the
looks
one.
good. So, Restoring Prana. It's available on my website, which I'll give you in a moment. Maybe do you want to type it in the chat? Also
Hmm.
available on Amazon. So it's essentialyogatherapy.com. And for those of you who are thinking, I think I have some of these issues and I could use a little yoga therapy on this, I do one-on-ones, and at this point, I work exclusively on Zoom because I'm working basically with a global community at this point. So this work, no matter where you are, I'd be happy to work with you. I work on all time zones. Um, and so reach out to me, Robin at essentialyogatherapy.com. And then you can look on my website. I have trainings for those of you who are yoga teachers who want to learn how to teach in this method, or want to transform your own breathing and your understanding of pranayama and become a skilled and educated, informed pranayama teacher, which I'm a big fan of. Yoga teachers, yoga therapists, or even other healthcare practitioners who use the breath, like massage therapists. I have massage therapists and psychotherapists in my program, who really PTs who want to use the breath and want to do it intelligently and with a good eye to functional breathing patterns, promoting them. So there's that training program, and we have the next launch, the next cohort starts in October, so it's not too early to learn about that. And then I also, on my store, I have a whole catalog, a library of possible practices that I've done on all different things, including like core engagement and strengthening for the lower back, pelvic floor, all that kind of stuff. But then also lots of stuff on the breath, and you can go through and pull some of those practices and just kind of jump into doing some of those practices on your own if you feel like you want to try it. But there's lots of practices in the book And then I also have the companion book to that, which is a practice workbook. I don't know if you have that, Brett, but that's Svadhyaya, which means self-awareness, breath journal. And it really gives you like charts and little journaling pages that you can take the practices and fill them in right then and there and start to develop your awareness around the breath, and gives you little cues about paying attention to this or that, and lots of questions about your EVA for you to reflect on, observe, and start to observe how you're expending energy, how you're taking in, how you're putting out, and what's happening in those times in between, with digestion and assimilation. And then it progressively goes into stronger practices and the biomechanics and all of that, as well as explanation of the biochemistry. So the breath journal is a really good, if you want to get into the practices deeply, the breath journal is very useful for that as a support. So yeah, so get in touch with me. I'm always happy and look forward to working with anybody that's interested in diving into the pull of the breath and joining me here. It's awesome. Highly recommend it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Robin, really from the bottom of my heart. This was so
Thank you
fun.
for the invitation.
So, of course. Yeah. All right. So we will catch you maybe in another time.
All right. Happy to come back anytime.
All right, friends, that was the episode. Thank you so much for listening all the way through till the end. That was Robin Rothenberg. If you want to stay in touch with her platform, consider checking out essentialyogatherapy.com. Again, she's got that new cohort starting up October 29th. Her book, Restoring Prana, is phenomenal. I went through it, and I love it. It's everything that I wanted from a book. So again, thank you so much for listening. If you want to support this show, head on over to patreon.com/21st Century Vitalism. Also consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts. That's a thing people do. You can subscribe on YouTube, like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram. Digital age, you know what to do. We're all living in it. So again, thank you so much. We will see you on the next episode with another amazing guest.